It was a humid September afternoon in 1903 when Eric Arthur Blair, later known to the world as George Orwell, was born in a modest house on Motihari in British-ruled India, the son of a minor civil servant in the imperial police. The very fact of his birth in a colonial outpost already set the stage for a life lived in the shadow of empire, a life that would later be spent interrogating the very structures that had shaped his earliest memories. One can almost hear the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages on the dusty streets, the murmuring of Bengali market vendors, and the faint echo of the British officer's orders, sounds that for a child were as natural as the lullabies sung by his mother. Yet those sounds also carried the weight of power, of a distant authority that claimed legitimacy simply by virtue of its uniform. In the quiet moments of his childhood, when the monsoon rains beat against the shutters, young Eric would watch the colonial officers move with a confidence that seemed both inevitable and, perhaps to a perceptive mind, unsettling. It is no coincidence that later, in his essays on imperialism, he would write, "The empire does not merely occupy the land, it occupies the imagination of those who live within its reach." This early exposure to the mechanics of domination, however subtle, planted the first seed of skepticism that would grow into a lifelong preoccupation with the abuse of power. When Orwell was 11, his family returned to England, and the boy entered St. Cyprian's, a preparatory school that, like many institutions of its day, was a microcosm of the British class hierarchy. The rigid discipline, the deference to authority, and the unspoken code of privilege were not merely lessons in etiquette. They were lessons in how societies organize themselves, how the few command the many, and how language becomes a tool of control. It was here that Orwell first encountered the works of Thomas Huxley, the famed Darwinian agnostic, whose essays on scientific rationalism and secular morality impressed upon the young student the importance of questioning received truths. Huxley's declaration that science is organized knowledge, wisdom is organized life, resonated with a mind already attuned to the contradictions of empire and class. Later, Orwell would echo this sentiment when he warned that the essence of totalitarianism is not in the use of force alone, but in the ability to shape reality itself. In the quiet corridors of St. Cyprian's, amidst the clatter of wooden desks, Orwell began to form an intellectual habit. To look beyond the surface and to ask why. The next pivotal chapter unfolded in the late 1920s, when a restless Orwell, now a young man of 24, accepted a posting as a police officer in the remote hills of Burma. The colonial police force was a thin line between the British Crown and the indigenous populations, a line drawn in sand and enforced with rifles and bureaucracy. It was here, under the scorching sun and the perpetual hum of cicadas, that Orwell first experienced the paradox of authority. The very institution meant to maintain order often became the instrument of oppression. In a diary entry dated 1927, he wrote, "I have seen the faces of men who have been reduced to a state of terror simply because they stand in the way of a distant empire's desire for profit." This moment of disillusionment was not merely personal. It was an awakening to the broader mechanisms of control that would later inform his critique of both fascist and socialist regimes. The Burmese landscape, with its lush jungles and stark poverty, also offered Orwell a stark contrast to the comforts of his English upbringing, reinforcing his awareness of economic inequality, a theme that would surface repeatedly in his later works, from Down and Out in Paris and London to The Road to Wigan Pier. Returning to England in 1929, Orwell entered the world of journalism, a field that at first glance seemed a natural extension of his desire to document reality. Yet even as he penned articles for the New Adelphi and the Tribune, he found himself increasingly uneasy with the constraints imposed by editors, advertisers, and political parties. He observed that the press is a powerful instrument of the state, not because it is a tool of the government, but because it is a conduit for the prevailing ideology of the ruling class. This insight was sharpened during his time at the BBC's Eastern Service in World War II, where he was tasked with broadcasting propaganda to the Indian subcontinent. In a letter to his friend Rainer Heppenstall, he confessed, "I am a man who writes truth. Yet I am asked to shape truth into a narrative that serves the war effort." The paradox of speaking truth while being asked to mold it for political ends became a crucible for Orwell's later assertion that the real danger is not that the state will be too powerful, but that it will be too cunning in its use of language. The BBC episode also provided a vivid anecdote. During a particularly tense broadcast, a mispronounced phrase about the Indian independence movement was corrected on the fly, prompting Orwell to mutter under his breath, "If a single word can shift the tide of a nation, then the pen is indeed mightier than the sword." This experience reinforced his belief that language is the battlefield upon which power is contested. Yet perhaps no experience shaped Orwell's political consciousness more dramatically than his involvement in the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, driven by a deep sense of solidarity with the anti-fascist cause, he traveled to the front lines of Barcelona, joining a militia of the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, POUM. It was there, amid the smoke of artillery and the frantic shouts of comrades, that Orwell faced a moment of stark, visceral terror. A sudden burst of rifle fire from an opposing nationalist position struck a fellow volunteer, sending a spray of blood across the trench. Orwell later recalled the scene with a haunting clarity. The world fell away in that instant, and all that remained was the cold, metallic taste of death in my mouth. The incident left him physically unharmed but emotionally scarred, a wound that would later be articulated in homage to Catalonia as both a personal trauma and a symbol of the betrayal of revolutionary ideals. The war also exposed him to the internal purges within leftist movements, as Stalinist agents infiltrated the POUM ranks, accusing comrades of Trotskyist deviation. Orwell's disillusionment with the Soviet model deepened, leading him to write, "The truth is that any revolution that does not preserve the freedom of its participants is doomed to become the very tyranny it sought to overthrow." This paradox, fighting fascism while witnessing the seeds of authoritarianism within one's own camp, became a cornerstone of his later critique of totalitarianism. The intellectual climate of the interwar period was a fertile ground for Orwell's evolving thought. Marx's analysis of class struggle provided a structural lens through which to view economic oppression, while the rise of fascist regimes in Italy, Germany, and Spain offered stark, contemporary illustrations of how ideology could be weaponized. Yet Orwell was never content to accept any doctrine wholesale. He read Tolstoy's War and Peace and was struck by the author's insistence that the only thing that can be truly known is the experience of the individual, a notion that would later inform Orwell's emphasis on personal integrity amidst systemic corruption. He also engaged with the writings of Aldous Huxley, whose Brave New World presented a dystopia of pleasure-induced conformity, contrasting sharply with Orwell's own vision of a world where oppression is maintained through fear and surveillance. In his notebooks, Orwell jotted, Huxley warns of a society numbed by comfort. "I fear a world where truth itself is dulled, not by pleasure, but by the endless rewriting of facts." These cross-references created a tapestry of ideas that allowed Orwell to see the totalitarian threat not as a singular phenomenon, but as a spectrum of tactics, propaganda, censorship, economic coercion, and the manipulation of desire. The British class system, too, loomed large in Orwell's consciousness. Growing up in a modest family, he was intimately aware of the social stratification that defined everyday life. In The Road to Wigan Pier, he described the grim reality of the industrial North, writing, "The working man is a man of the earth, yet he is treated as if his labor were a commodity to be bought and sold. His dignity a negotiable term." His observations of the stark divide between the landed gentry and the laboring masses resonated with Marx's critique of capitalist exploitation. Yet Orwell added a distinctly British flavor to the analysis. He noted, in England, the class divide is not always shouted. It is whispered in the language we use, the accents we adopt, the doors we are allowed to pass through. This insight would later be echoed in his essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, where he argued that the British people needed both a socialist vision and a patriotic identity to overcome the tyranny of class hierarchy. By intertwining the critique of imperialism, the horrors of war, and the entrenched British class system, Orwell crafted a comprehensive view of power that transcended any single ideology. Two vivid anecdotes illustrate the depth of Orwell's engagement with power. The first, the shooting incident on the Spanish front, has already been recounted, but its significance lies not merely in the physical danger, but in the psychological rupture it caused. As the bullet whizzed past, Orwell felt a sudden clarity. The abstract political slogans that had motivated him, "No fascist shall prevail," were now tangled with the very real possibility of death. He later reflected, war strips away the veneer of ideology and reveals the raw human impulse to survive. The second anecdote occurs much later, in the cramped studios of the BBC's broadcasting house. In 1941, as the war intensified, Orwell was assigned to produce a series of talks aimed at bolstering Indian morale. One evening, after a particularly heated discussion with a senior producer about the tone of the broadcasts, Orwell stood before a microphone and with a steady voice declared, "We must not betray the very people we claim to support by speaking to them as if they are children." The producer, a man of considerable influence, retorted, "You are a writer, not a diplomat." Orwell's reply, recorded in a marginal note, read, "A writer's duty is to truth. A diplomat's duty is to the state. when the two diverge, the writer must choose. This moment encapsulated his enduring skepticism of power, that even those ostensibly fighting for freedom could become complicit in the very mechanisms of control they opposed. Critics have sometimes dismissed Orwell as merely a political journalist, arguing that his works lack the systematic rigor of a philosopher and that his insights are rooted in anecdotal experience rather than abstract theory. They point to his clear, narrative style as evidence of a journalist's penchant for storytelling over philosophical depth. Yet this critique overlooks the profound philosophical underpinnings that run through his oeuvre. In 1984, for instance, Orwell does not merely tell a dystopian story. He constructs a comprehensive theory of doublethink, a cognitive dissonance that allows totalitarian regimes to rewrite reality. He writes to know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while simultaneously denying it, is the essence of the modern tyranny. This is not a journalistic observation, but a philosophical claim about the nature of truth and consciousness. Moreover, in Animal Farm, the allegorical narrative serves as a critique of the corruption of revolutionary ideals, echoing Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, yet also extending it with a moral dimension that questions the ethical responsibilities of the individual within a collective. The essay Politics in the English Language further demonstrates Orwell's philosophical engagement with the relationship between language and thought, arguing that if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought, a claim that anticipates later linguistic philosophy, such as Wittgenstein's later work on language games. Thus, to reduce Orwell to a mere chronicler of events is to miss the systematic way he interrogates the structures that shape human experience, blending empirical observation with a rigorous philosophical analysis of power, truth, and morality. The counter-argument that Orwell's writings are primarily literary rather than philosophical can be met with textual evidence from his own reflections on the purpose of literature. In a 1945 essay, he declared, "All literature is political. Even the most apolitical novel is a reflection of the society that produced it." This statement positions literature as a form of philosophical inquiry, a means of exploring the ethical dimensions of human life. Furthermore, his correspondence with the literary critic Cyril Connolly reveals a deliberate intention to embed philosophical questions within narrative form. "I aim to write stories that make the reader question the very foundations of their belief in authority, in justice, in the self." These letters demonstrate that Orwell was consciously employing narrative as a vehicle for philosophical exploration, not merely as a journalistic recounting of events. To understand the full impact of Orwell's intellectual formation, one must also consider the broader historical currents of the 1930s. The rise of totalitarian regimes, Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and Stalin's Soviet Union, presented a terrifying convergence of nationalist fervor, charismatic leadership, and state-controlled propaganda. Orwell observed these developments with a mixture of alarm and analytical curiosity. In a 1938 essay, he wrote, "The totalitarian state is not a new invention. It is the logical extension of the modern bureaucratic apparatus, where the individual is reduced to a mere function within an ever-expanding machine." He recognized that the same mechanisms that allowed a British colonial officer to enforce order in Burma could, when amplified, produce a regime capable of orchestrating the Holocaust. This insight is reinforced by his analysis of the British class system, where he argued that the deference to hierarchy and the acceptance of authority are cultural traits that can be exploited by any authoritarian regime. By linking the British social order to the global rise of tyranny, Orwell laid the groundwork for his later warning that the very institutions we trust can become the tools of oppression if we cease to question them. Another historical anecdote that illuminates Orwell's skepticism of power involves his brief tenure as a police constable in Burma. One night while on patrol in the remote town of Moulmein, he was ordered to arrest a local merchant accused of smuggling opium. The merchant, an elderly man known for his generosity to the poor, was taken into custody without evidence, his family pleading for mercy. Orwell, witnessing the arbitrary exercise of authority, later recounted, "The law was a thin veil stretched over the desires of the empire, and those who wore the uniform could, at a whim, decide the fate of a man's life." This incident, though seemingly minor, reinforced his belief that power, when unchecked, becomes a tool for personal and institutional abuse, a theme that would echo throughout his later works. The interplay between Orwell's personal experiences and the intellectual influences of his time created a unique synthesis. Marx's analysis of class provided a structural framework, yet Orwell rejected the deterministic aspects of Marxist theory, preferring instead a moralistic approach that emphasized individual responsibility. Tolstoy's advocacy for non-violent resistance and spiritual integrity offered a counterpoint to the violent upheavals of revolution, informing Orwell's belief that the fight against oppression must be waged not only on the battlefield but within the conscience of each person. Huxley's cautionary vision of a society numbed by pleasure reminded Orwell that totalitarianism could arise not only through overt force but through the subtle erosion of critical thought. By weaving these threads together, Orwell crafted a philosophical stance that was both deeply rooted in the political realities of his era and timeless in its warning about the fragility of freedom. When we examine Orwell's writings, the echo of these formative experiences is unmistakable. In 1984, the omnipresent Big Brother represents not only the Soviet totalitarian model, but also the lingering presence of imperial authority that Orwell witnessed in Burma. The Ministry of Truth, tasked with rewriting history, mirrors the BBC's wartime broadcasts where truth was filtered through the needs of the state. The concept of Newspeak, a language engineered to limit thought, can be traced back to the propaganda techniques Orwell observed during the Spanish Civil War, where slogans were used to simplify complex realities into binary oppositions. The party's slogan, "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength," encapsulates the doublethink Orwell experienced on the front lines, where the fight against fascism could be twisted into a justification for authoritarian control. Each of these elements is not a mere fictional invention, but a distilled reflection of the real-world mechanisms Orwell encountered. In Animal Farm, the rise of the pigs to a ruling class serves as an allegory for the Soviet betrayal of the 1917 revolution. Yet the story also resonates with the British class system, where a small elite maintains power through control of resources and language. The commandment, "all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," is a direct commentary on the hypocrisy inherent in any hierarchical society that claims equality while perpetuating privilege. Orwell's own experience of poverty in England, living in a cramped attic in Paris and later in a squalid lodging in London, gave him a visceral understanding of how economic deprivation can be weaponized by those in power to keep the masses compliant. He wrote in Down and Out in Paris and London, "The hunger of the poor is not just a physical emptiness, but a psychological void that can be filled by the promise of a better future, however false." This insight underpins his critique of both capitalist exploitation and socialist co-optation. The question remains, does Orwell's work constitute philosophy, or is it merely political commentary? The answer lies in his own articulation of the role of the writer. In his essay Why I Write, he declares, "I write because I have a duty to the truth, and because the world needs to be examined, not merely described." He distinguishes between reporting facts and interpreting them within a broader ethical framework. This interpretive act, asking why events happen, what they mean for human dignity, how language shapes perception, places Orwell squarely within the philosophical tradition of critical theory. He engages with the same concerns that preoccupied the Frankfurt School: the relationship between culture and power, the ways in which mass media can serve as an instrument of domination. Yet unlike many of his contemporaries, Orwell grounds his analysis in concrete experience, refusing to abstract away the lived realities of the people he writes about. In this sense, his philosophy is a praxis, an applied theory that seeks to illuminate and transform the world. The modern relevance of Orwell's intellectual formation cannot be overstated. In an age where digital surveillance, algorithmic curation, and fake news dominate public discourse, the questions he raised about language, truth, and power are more pressing than ever. The rise of populist movements that exploit class anxieties mirrors the British class tensions that Orwell dissected in the 1930s. The manipulation of historical narratives by state actors echoes the Ministry of Truth's rewriting of the past. And the subtle ways in which corporate interests shape public opinion recall the propaganda techniques Orwell observed in the Spanish Civil War. By tracing the origins of his thought from the colonial streets of Burma through the trenches of Spain to the studios of the BBC, we can better understand the foundations of his warnings and apply them to contemporary challenges. In reflecting on Orwell's life, one cannot help but ask, what would he say about the world today? Would he see the same patterns of power, or would new forms of domination emerge that he could not have imagined? The answer perhaps lies in his own humility. In a letter to his sister, he wrote, "I am not a prophet, but a chronicler of the present, hoping that my observations may help future generations recognize the signs of tyranny before they become irreversible." This modest self-assessment underscores his belief that philosophy is not an abstract pursuit removed from everyday life, but a vigilant practice that requires constant observation, critical analysis, and moral courage. As we conclude this exploration of Orwell's historical roots, let us carry forward his insistence on questioning authority, his commitment to truth, and his unwavering belief that the individual, armed with clarity of thought, can resist the encroachments of power. The story of George Orwell is not just a biography. It is a roadmap for navigating the complex terrain of modern politics, a reminder that the fight against oppression begins in the quiet moments of reflection, just as it did for a young boy listening to the monsoon rains in Motihari. It is tempting to think of language as a mere vehicle, a transparent conduit that carries thoughts from mind to mind without altering their shape. Yet, when we turn to the work of George Orwell, that comfortable illusion shatters. In the dim corridors of his imagination, language becomes a lever, a weapon, a battlefield where power is both exercised and concealed. In this segment, we will wander through the origins of Orwell's linguistic concerns, trace the lineage of his ideas through the work of philosophers such as Ludwig Wittgenstein, J.L. Austin, and Jacques Derrida, and examine the concrete mechanisms he identified, Newspeak and doublethink. We will pause at two emblematic passages from 1984. The slogan, "War is Peace," and the very name of the Ministry of Truth. From there we will explore how Orwell argued that the shape of our language sculpts the limits of our thought, and how that argument reverberates in contemporary studies of framing, political rhetoric, and digital discourse. Along the way we will meet counter-arguments that accuse Orwell of exaggerating language's power, and of imposing a prescriptive orthodoxy that mirrors the authoritarianism he warned against. By the end, the hope is that you will hear not only the echo of Orwell's warning, but also the chorus of scholars who have taken his warning up the hill, examined it, and in some cases reshaped it for a new age. The seed of Orwell's preoccupation with language was sown long before 1984 was ever written. In the 1930s, while covering the Spanish Civil War for the BBC, Orwell witnessed firsthand how political factions weaponized words. The phrase, "the fascist terror of the nationalists," was not a neutral description. It was a strategic framing that sought to mobilize sympathy and outrage in Britain. Later, during his tenure at the Indian Daily Express, he observed the colonial administration's careful choice of terms, civilizing mission, native customs, that cloaked exploitation in a veneer of benevolence. These experiences coalesced into a conviction that language is never innocent, that it is always already implicated in power structures. Orwell crystallized this conviction in his 1946 essay Politics and the English Language. He wrote, "If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought." The essay is a meticulous dissection of the ways in which vague, stale, or deliberately obfuscating prose can erode the clarity of political thinking. He enumerated 6 common sins, dying metaphors, pretentious diction, meaningless words, and so forth, each a small crack that, when multiplied across a culture, can lead to a collapse of honest discourse. The essay is not merely a style guide, it is a moral indictment, an invitation to see the political consequences of sloppy writing. Orwell's central claim is that the decay of language is both a symptom and a cause of the decay of political life. To understand the philosophical roots of this claim, we can look back to Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus and later his philosophical investigations. Wittgenstein famously asserted, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." In the early Tractatus, he presented language as a logical picture of reality, a mirror that can only reflect what can be said. Later, in his later work, he shifted to the idea of language games. Meaning arises from the use of words within specific forms of life. This move away from a static correspondence theory toward a use theory of meaning resonates with Orwell's observation that when the rules of the language game are altered, the very possibilities for thought shift. If the state rewrites the rules of the game, then the shape of the world that speakers can conceive is altered as well. Another crucial interlocutor is J.L. Austin, whose How to Do Things with Words introduced the notion of speech acts, utterances that do not merely describe but perform actions. Austin distinguished between locutionary acts, the act of saying something, illocutionary acts, the act performed in saying it, promising, ordering, warning, and perlocutionary effects, the consequences that follow. Orwell's Newspeak can be read as a systematic reconfiguration of illocutionary force. By stripping away words that enable dissent, the regime removes the very capacity to perform acts of resistance. When the word freedom disappears, the illocutionary act of demanding freedom becomes impossible. In this sense, the term Newspeak itself is a linguistic construct designed to limit thought. In 1984, the party's official language is a carefully engineered reduction of English, a language that eliminates synonyms, antonyms, and any nuance that could support subversive ideas. The party's slogan, "War is Peace," is a perfect illustration of doublethink, a term Orwell coined to describe the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously and to accept both as true. The slogan is not merely paradoxical, it is a purposeful resignification. War, traditionally understood as destructive conflict, is rebranded as peace because it serves the party's goal of maintaining internal stability. The citizens are taught to accept that perpetual war abroad guarantees a stable, unthreatened domestic life. The contradiction is not resolved, it is sustained through constant reinforcement, through the ritual of the 2 minutes hate, and through the very structure of Newspeak, which removes any word that could articulate the inconsistency. The Ministry of Truth, or Minitru as it is abbreviated in Newspeak, offers a second concrete example. Its purpose, as the party's propaganda declares, is to rectify history, to ensure that the official record always aligns with the present party line. In practice, this means that any newspaper article, photograph, or speech that once praised a now disfavored party member is altered, erased, or replaced. The name Ministry of Truth is a classic case of doublethink in naming. It is a lie that is presented as a truth. By naming the apparatus of falsification as a Ministry of Truth, the party creates a linguistic shield that protects the act of lying from moral scrutiny. The very word truth is thus emptied of its normative weight, becoming a neutral label for any official statement, regardless of its factual accuracy. Orwell's analysis of these mechanisms is not merely fictional speculation. It is rooted in historical precedents. Consider the Soviet Union's practice of Pravo, the official rewriting of history to glorify Stalin after his death. Photographs were altered, speeches were edited, and entire chapters of textbooks were excised. The term Stalinist itself became a label that could be applied both to the glorified leader and to the brutal repressor, depending on the political need. In Nazi Germany, the Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Joseph Goebbels, systematically manipulated language to dehumanize Jews, using euphemisms like final solution to mask genocide. These historical anecdotes demonstrate that Orwell's fictional constructs are, in fact, distilled versions of real, documented practices. The party's slogans echo the Nazi slogan Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, which collapsed complex political realities into a single, unchallengeable mantra. The Soviet practice of renaming cities, St. Petersburg to Leningrad, then back again, shows how place names can be weaponized to shape collective memory. To place Orwell's concerns within the broader philosophical conversation, we must turn to post-structuralist thinkers, especially Jacques Derrida. Derrida's deconstruction argues that meaning is never fixed, it is always deferred, a play of differences, difference. From this perspective, the idea that a regime could fix meaning through a controlled language appears both possible and paradoxical. Derrida would say that any attempt to pin down meaning is already subject to the endless chain of signifiers that undermine it. Yet Derrida also acknowledges that the very act of imposing a rigid structure, what he calls logocentrism, can produce a kind of power that silences alternative signification. In this sense, Orwell's warning anticipates Derrida's critique. A language that claims to be the final word on reality inevitably suppresses the play of meaning that makes dissent possible. While Derrida might argue that the collapse of meaning is inevitable, Orwell insists that we can, at least temporarily, stave off that collapse by preserving linguistic diversity and clarity. There are, however, two prominent counter-arguments that challenge Orwell's emphasis on language. The first claims that Orwell overstates the causal power of language over thought. Critics point to cognitive science, which suggests that thought can precede language, that humans can conceive of abstract concepts even when lacking precise terminology. The philosopher Hilary Putnam, for instance, argues that meaning is not determined solely by linguistic convention, but also by the external world, a view known as semantic externalism. From this angle, the argument goes, the party's manipulation of language may be a symptom rather than a cause of ideological control. The underlying material conditions, poverty, surveillance, coercion, are the true engines of obedience. The second counter-argument attacks Orwell's prescriptive style, especially his essay Politics in the English Language, as itself authoritarian. Critics such as Stephen Levy have suggested that Orwell's insistence on a clear, precise, and concrete prose style imposes a normative standard that can become a tool of censorship, just as the party imposes its own linguistic standards. By declaring certain forms of expression bad, Orwell could be seen as exercising a form of linguistic gatekeeping that mirrors the very totalitarian impulse he condemns. Both objections deserve careful consideration, but they also open a space for a more nuanced synthesis. Contemporary research in political communication provides empirical evidence that language does indeed shape perception, a process known as framing. The work of Irving Goffman on frame analysis shows that the way an issue is presented influences the range of interpretations available to an audience. More recent studies by George Lakoff and Frank Fiorina on framing in political rhetoric demonstrate that strategic language can activate certain mental models, making some policy options seem natural and others absurd. For example, describing a tax cut as a tax relief frames it as a benevolent act, whereas calling it a tax reduction sounds more neutral. These findings suggest that Orwell was not merely indulging in literary dramatization. He was anticipating a robust body of evidence that language can guide, constrain, and even manufacture public opinion. Similarly, the critique of Orwell's prescriptivism can be softened by recognizing that his prescriptions are not meant to be dogmatic rules, but rather a call to vigilance. In Politics in the English Language, he does not demand that all writers adopt a sterile, utilitarian style. Rather, he urges writers to be aware of the political consequences of their choices. He writes, "If you simplify your style, you will be forced to think more clearly." The imperative is towards self-reflection, not authoritarian enforcement. In practice, this self-reflection can be institutionalized through editorial standards that encourage transparency, as seen in modern journalistic codes of ethics. The existence of style guides, such as the Associated Press or the Chicago Manual, does not constitute tyranny. Rather, they serve as tools for consistency and clarity, echoing Orwell's call for linguistic honesty. To see how Orwell's insights play out in the modern world, consider the phenomenon of political spin in contemporary media. In the United States, the term enhanced interrogation techniques was deliberately chosen to soften the moral weight of practices that many consider torture. By substituting torture with a more bureaucratic phrase, the administration reframed the activity as a legitimate, even necessary, security measure. This mirrors the party's redefinition of freedom and war in 1984. Another example comes from the corporate sphere. The phrase right-sizing replaces downsizing, suggesting a strategic, positive adjustment rather than a painful reduction in staff. The rebranding of a painful reality through language can alter both the perception of employees and the public, reducing resistance and facilitating acceptance. In both cases, the power of language to shape thought is evident, confirming Orwell's warning that the manipulation of language is a central tool in the exercise of power. Social media platforms add a new layer to this dynamic. Algorithms that prioritize short, emotionally charged headlines encourage the use of sensationalist language, which in turn narrows the public discourse. The term fake news, once a descriptor of outright falsehoods, has been co-opted by political actors to discredit any unfavorable reporting, regardless of its veracity. This strategic deployment of language creates a feedback loop. The more the term is used to dismiss dissent, the more the public becomes skeptical of legitimate journalism, and the more the space for meaningful debate shrinks. The phenomenon can be read as a contemporary form of doublethink, where the same phrase simultaneously denotes falsehood and truth, depending on who wields it. Even the legal sphere is not immune. The doctrine of clear and convincing evidence in jurisprudence relies on the assumption that precise language can convey objective truth. Yet, as philosophers of language have long argued, the meaning of legal terms is often contested and context-dependent. The United Kingdom's Brexit referendum illustrates how a single word, leave, encapsulated a multitude of meanings, from economic independence to cultural sovereignty, leading to a profound disconnect between political promises and policy outcomes. The linguistic ambiguity allowed various factions to project their own narratives onto the same term, a process Orwell would have identified as the manipulation of language to manufacture consent. Returning to the novel, the scene in which Winston Smith rewrites historical records in the Ministry of Truth offers a vivid metaphor for the contemporary practice of revisionist history on digital platforms. When a user edits a Wikipedia article to align it with a particular political stance, they are performing a small-scale version of the same act, altering the collective memory to match present interests. The difference lies in scale and oversight. The party's ministry operates under a totalitarian regime, while Wikipedia relies on community consensus. Nevertheless, both illustrate how control over textual records can shape the present understanding of the past, reinforcing the notion that who controls the past controls the future, a line that Orwell himself wrote. Who controls the past controls the present, who controls the present controls the future. This aphorism encapsulates the core of his argument. Language is the conduit through which power reaches into the mind. The philosophical lineage continues with the work of Mitchell Foucault, who, though not a post-structuralist in the strict sense, explored the relationship between discourse and power. In the archaeology of knowledge, Foucault argues that discourse is not simply a means of communication, but a system of formation that produces knowledge and truth. The party's Newspeak can be seen as an extreme form of what Foucault calls regimes of truth, where the state defines what counts as true and false, and the language itself enforces that division. Foucault's analysis supports Orwell's claim that language is not a neutral medium, but a structural component of power relations. While Foucault emphasizes the historical contingency of discursive formations, Orwell focuses on the intentional engineering of language to serve a totalizing ideology. Together, they offer complementary perspectives. Foucault provides the genealogical method to trace how discourses evolve, while Orwell supplies the narrative illustration of what happens when that evolution is halted and forced in a single direction. We have so far woven together historical anecdotes, philosophical cross-references, concrete examples from literature, and modern case studies. Let us now consider how Orwell's ideas have been taken up in contemporary academic discourse. In the field of cognitive linguistics, scholars such as George Lakoff have built on the notion that metaphors shape thought. Lakoff argues that the metaphor argument is war structures political discourse, influencing how we conceive of debate as a battle to be won rather than a collaborative search for truth. This metaphorical framing mirrors Orwell's observation that war is peace is not a logical contradiction but a linguistic device that reorients perception. By recognizing the metaphorical underpinnings, activists can deliberately choose alternative frames. Argument is a dance, for instance, to foster a more cooperative political climate. This strategic reframing is a direct response to Orwell's warning: if language can be weaponized, it can also be reclaimed. Another contemporary development is the field of critical discourse analysis, CDA, pioneered by scholars such as Norman Fairclough. CDA systematically examines how language in texts, political speeches, news articles, corporate reports reproduces social hierarchies. Fairclough's three-dimensional model looks at textual features, discursive practices, and social practices. Using this framework, researchers have documented how the language of national security can be used to justify surveillance measures that would otherwise be deemed invasive. The term national security functions similarly to Newspeak's peace in the slogan "War is peace," providing a linguistic shield that masks the coercive nature of the policies it justifies. In this way, Orwell's fictional constructs have become analytical tools for scholars dissecting real-world power structures. Yet, the critique that Orwell's analysis is overly deterministic remains potent. Some scholars argue that individuals can resist linguistic manipulation by developing counter-languages. The African American community's creation of AAVE, African American Vernacular English, and the reclamation of slurs as terms of empowerment illustrate how marginalized groups can subvert dominant linguistic regimes. By reappropriating language, they undermine the authority of the dominant discourse. This phenomenon aligns with Derrida's idea that meaning is always open to reinterpretation, suggesting that even in the face of a tightly controlled language, resistance can emerge through creative linguistic play. The existence of counterlanguages also challenges the notion that language can fully determine thought. It shows that agency can be exercised within and against linguistic constraints. In the realm of technology, artificial intelligence introduces a new frontier for Orwellian concerns. Language models trained on massive corpora of text can inadvertently reproduce and amplify biases embedded in the data. When a chatbot consistently uses gendered pronouns for certain professions, it reinforces stereotypes through language. This is a subtle form of algorithmic doublethink, where the system presents itself as neutral while perpetuating discriminatory narratives. Researchers at institutions such as MIT and Stanford have begun to develop methods for debiasing these models, essentially attempting to re-engineer the language of machines to prevent the reinforcement of harmful ideologies. The effort mirrors Orwell's call for a vigilant, conscious shaping of language, now extended to the digital realm. To bring these threads together, let us revisit the two concrete examples from 1984 and see how they illuminate the broader philosophical landscape. The slogan "War is peace" functions as a linguistic paradox that collapses oppositional concepts into a single, state-sanctioned meaning. Wittgenstein would note that the meaning of the words war and peace is determined by their use in the language game of the party. By altering the rules of that game, the party reassigns the use value of the words, thereby reshaping the speaker's conceptual world. Austin would point out that the utterance "war is peace" is not merely a statement of fact. It is an illocutionary act that performs the function of legitimizing perpetual conflict. The perlocutionary effect is the acceptance by the populace of the state's policy. Derrida would remind us that the signifier war and the signified peace are caught in a difference that destabilizes any fixed meaning, yet the party's forceful imposition attempts to suspend that difference, freezing the signifier in a single, authoritarian interpretation. The Ministry of Truth, meanwhile, exemplifies the institutionalization of linguistic control. Its name is a performative contradiction. It claims to uphold truth while systematically falsifying it. This is a classic case of what Austin called a performative contradiction. The speech act's performative force is at odds with its propositional content. The ministry's daily work, rewriting newspaper articles, altering photographs, erasing individuals from public records, creates a reality in which the past is constantly reshaped to fit the present narrative. In modern terms, this is akin to information laundering, where falsehoods are cleaned, repackaged, and reintroduced as credible facts. The phenomenon can be observed in the spread of deepfakes, where fabricated videos are presented as authentic evidence, blurring the line between truth and fabrication. The ethical implications echo Orwell's warning that once language is weaponized, the very notion of objective truth becomes precarious. Let us now pause and consider an analogy that may help to internalize these dynamics. Imagine a garden in which the gardener decides not only which plants to cultivate, but also which colors the flowers may display. If the gardener restricts the palette to only shades of gray, the garden loses its vibrancy. The visitor's experience of beauty is narrowed. Similarly, a regime that restricts language to a limited set of terms deprives its citizens of the cognitive colors that enable nuanced thought. The garden may still function, but it lacks the richness that fosters creativity, dissent, and growth. By contrast, a garden that embraces a diverse array of species and colors invites pollinators, promotes ecological resilience, and offers a multitude of sensory experiences. In the realm of ideas, linguistic diversity functions as that ecological richness, allowing societies to adapt, critique, and evolve. Historically, we have seen both the pruning and the flourishing of linguistic gardens. The English Reformation under Henry VII provides an early modern example of deliberate language control. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, mandated that all official documents use the term supreme head to refer to the monarch, effectively rebranding the religious authority of the Pope as a secular one. This linguistic shift was not merely symbolic, it reshaped the political theology of the nation, aligning religious obedience with loyalty to the crown. Conversely, the Enlightenment era witnessed a blossoming of linguistic experimentation. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Diderot championed clarity, reason, and the use of vernacular French over Latin, expanding the public's access to ideas and fostering a culture of debate. Their linguistic reforms contributed to a broader democratization of knowledge, a stark contrast to the linguistic ossification Orwell feared. In the 20th century, the Soviet Union's policy of language planning under Stalin sought to standardize Russian and suppress regional languages, thereby reinforcing central control. The suppression of Ukrainian, Baltic, and Central Asian languages was a strategic move to limit the formation of distinct national identities, mirroring the party's suppression of thought crime. Yet, the eventual resurgence of these languages after the Soviet collapse illustrates the resilience of linguistic diversity. Even when a regime imposes a monolithic language, the human impulse to create and preserve alternative modes of expression persists, offering a counterweight to authoritarian linguistic control. In light of these historical patterns, we can see that Orwell's analysis is not a static prescription, but a dynamic framework for interrogating the relationship between language and power across epochs. His concepts of Newspeak and doublethink serve as lenses through which we can examine any context where language is engineered to constrain thought, whether in totalitarian regimes, corporate branding, or algorithmic curation. The cross-referencing with Wittgenstein, Austin, Derrida, Foucault, and contemporary scholars enriches the picture, showing that the philosophical debate about language's role in shaping reality is both deep and ongoing. To address the first counter-argument, Orwell's alleged exaggeration, we can turn to the field of neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, and the work of cognitive psychologists like Steven Pinker. Pinker's research on semantic bleaching demonstrates that repeated exposure to certain terms can diminish their emotional impact. For instance, the phrase collateral damage has been shown to reduce the perceived moral weight of civilian casualties in warfare. This empirical finding aligns with Orwell's claim that language can dull moral sensibilities, thereby facilitating acceptance of otherwise abhorrent policies. Moreover, the concept of conceptual metaphors shows that abstract ideas are often understood through concrete bodily experiences. Argument is war, time is money, and that manipulating these metaphors can shift public attitudes. Thus, the claim that language merely reflects thought underestimates the bidirectional influence that contemporary research confirms. Addressing the second counter-argument, Orwell's prescriptivism as authoritarian, we can note that his own style is deliberately modest, invoking a plain style that resists grandiosity. In Politics and the English Language, he writes, "If you simplify your style, you will be forced to think more clearly. The imperative is toward self-discipline, not external coercion." Modern style guides which echo this ethos are typically voluntary and grounded in professional consensus rather than state-imposed mandates. Moreover, the very act of critiquing language is an exercise of freedom of expression. It invites debate about the standards themselves. In this sense, Orwell's prescriptive stance can be understood as a call for a democratic discourse about language, not a monolithic imposition. The relevance of Orwell's insights extends into the realm of education. Pedagogical approaches that emphasize critical reading and writing skills empower students to recognize manipulative language. The Socratic method, for instance, trains learners to dissect arguments, question premises, and expose hidden assumptions. By cultivating such analytical habits, educators enact Orwell's vision of a populace that is resistant to linguistic manipulation. In contrast, curricula that prioritize rote memorization without fostering critical engagement may inadvertently aid the very doublethink Orwell warned against, by encouraging uncritical acceptance of official narratives. Finally, let us consider a contemporary illustration that brings together many of the strands we have woven. In 2020, a major social media platform introduced a policy to label political advertisements with a paid content tag. The intention was to increase transparency, to make clear when a message was funded by an organization rather than an organic expression. However, critics argued that the label itself could be used to delegitimize certain viewpoints, framing them as propaganda, regardless of content. The language of the label, paid content, became a site of contestation, a modern echo of the Ministry of Truth's official statement. Activists responded by creating alternative tags such as civic message or public interest, attempting to reclaim the framing. This back and forth mirrors the perpetual struggle between linguistic control and resistance, a struggle that Orwell dramatized and that philosophers of language continue to analyze. In sum, the politics of language, as illuminated by George Orwell, is a tapestry woven from threads of philosophy, history, psychology, and technology. Newspeak and doublethink are not merely fictional curiosities. They are analytical tools that help us recognize how language can be engineered to shape thought, to silence dissent, and to legitimize power. Wittgenstein reminds us that the limits of language are the limits of our world. Austin shows us that words do things. Derrida warns us of the endless play of meaning that can be harnessed for control. Foucault reveals the regimes of truth that undergird power structures. And contemporary scholars provide empirical evidence that framing and discourse analysis can measure the impact of linguistic manipulation. Counter-arguments remind us to remain vigilant against deterministic readings and to guard against the temptation to impose our own linguistic orthodoxy. Yet the weight of evidence, from the Soviet revision of history to modern algorithmic bias, supports Orwell's central claim. Language is a battlefield, and the stakes are nothing less than the freedom of the mind. As we close this exploration, remember the words that Orwell himself penned in 1984. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. The act of affirming a simple mathematical truth becomes an act of resistance against a language that seeks to deny it. In our own lives, the equivalent may be the willingness to name a problem, to call a policy propaganda when it obscures truth, or to demand that a corporate report be written in plain language rather than cloaked in jargon. Each such act is a small yet potent countermeasure against the encroaching tide of linguistic control. By sharpening our awareness of how words shape thought, we honor Orwell's warning, we heed the philosophers who have mapped the terrain of meaning, and we keep the garden of ideas vibrant, diverse, and alive. When we turn our attention to the work of George Orwell, we are invited into a landscape where the ordinary and the monstrous are inextricably entwined, where a farmyard becomes a mirror for the world, and a bleak cityscape becomes a warning that still reverberates in the glow of our screens. Orwell's philosophical stance on totalitarianism is not merely a political diagnosis. It is an ethical inquiry into the conditions under which human beings can retain their conscience, their capacity for solidarity, and their commitment to truth. To understand this stance, we must first trace the intellectual lineage that shaped his thinking, an inheritance that draws from the tradition of liberal socialism, the cautionary histories of the Russian Revolution, and the existential dread of a world scarred by 2 world wars. Orwell-born Eric Arthur Blair grew up in the waning days of the British Empire, witnessed the horrors of the Spanish Civil War, and served in the Home Guard during the Second World War. These lived experiences forged in him a deep skepticism toward any ideology that demanded the surrender of individual judgment to a monolithic authority. He was, in the words of his own essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, a socialist who believes in the necessity of freedom. This paradoxical self-identification, socialist yet fiercely protective of liberty, places him alongside thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, who argued that over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign, and the early Marxist tradition that envisioned a classless society without the tyranny of a ruling elite. Yet Orwell's socialism was always tempered by a moral realism that refused to overlook the ways in which power can corrupt even the most well-intentioned movements. In Animal Farm, the allegory unfolds with a simple premise. Animals overthrow their human owner, only to find themselves under the hooves of a new, more insidious oppressor. The famous line, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," distills the core of Orwell's critique of totalitarianism into a single, chilling paradox. The novel does not merely recount a historical episode. It exposes the mechanism by which revolutionary rhetoric can be hijacked by a few who manipulate language, rewrite history, and cultivate a cult of personality. The pigs who initially champion the cause of animalism gradually adopt the very habits they once condemned, illustrating what Hannah Arendt later called the banality of evil, the ordinary, bureaucratic processes that enable atrocities to become normalized. Orwell's 1984 pushes this analysis further, presenting a world where the state's reach extends into the very thoughts of its citizens. The party's slogan, "War is peace, freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength," encapsulates the doctrine of doublethink, a cognitive dissonance that forces individuals to accept contradictory truths. The omnipresent telescreen, the ever-watchful Big Brother, and the Ministry of Truth all serve as instruments of a regime that seeks not only to control actions, but to dominate the very capacity for self-reflection. In a passage that has become a touchstone for discussions of surveillance, Winston Smith writes, "If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever." This image is not merely a literary device. It is an ethical challenge, urging us to consider the cost of surrendering our inner lives to an external authority. The moral framework that Orwell proposes for resistance emerges from three interlocking pillars: individual conscience, solidarity, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth. First, the individual conscience is the inner voice that refuses to be silenced, even when the external world demands conformity. In 1984, Winston's secret diary represents this private act of rebellion, to the future or to the past, to a time when there will be no party, I write. The act of writing, of recording one's own experience, becomes an assertion of selfhood against a regime that seeks to erase the past. Second, solidarity, what Orwell calls the comradeship of the oppressed, is essential because isolation makes the individual vulnerable to the state's coercive apparatus. The moment when the animals of Animal Farm begin to chant "4 legs good, 2 legs bad" in unison, they demonstrate the power of collective belief, even as that belief is later twisted. Finally, the importance of truth is perhaps the most urgent. Orwell understood that truth is not a static commodity but a battlefield where power struggles are fought. The party's slogan, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past," underscores the centrality of historical memory to any resistance. To see how these pillars operate in history, we can turn to two stark anecdotes. The first is the Great Purge of the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, a campaign of political repression orchestrated by Joseph Stalin. In the span of just a few years, millions were arrested, exiled, or executed on the basis of fabricated charges. The purges were justified through a language of counter-revolutionary activity, a term that Orwell would later recognize as a tool for silencing dissent. The atmosphere of fear forced many to betray their colleagues, eroding the solidarity that could have resisted the regime's terror. Yet amidst the horror, a few individuals, like the poet Osip Mandelstam, clung to their conscience, continuing to write verses that, though censored, kept alive an alternative narrative. Their private acts of resistance echo Winston's diary, reminding us that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit can assert its autonomy. The second anecdote takes us to Britain in the 1940s, where the Domestic Intelligence Service MI5 embarked on a covert surveillance program aimed at monitoring suspected subversives, including members of the Communist Party and even some trade unionists. Known as the Security Services surveillance of left-wing groups, this operation involved intercepting mail, tapping telephone lines, and infiltrating meetings. While the official rationale was national security, the methods raised profound ethical questions about the balance between collective safety and individual liberty. Orwell, who worked for the BBC's Eastern Service during the war, was acutely aware of the tension between the state's protective role and its potential for overreach. The very existence of such surveillance foreshadows the telescreens of 1984, suggesting that the line between legitimate security measures and intrusive totalitarian tools can be alarmingly thin. Fast forward to the 21st century, and Orwell's warnings appear in the glow of digital screens. The modern surveillance state is no longer limited to physical observation. It now operates through algorithms that track our every click, our locations, our preferences. The revelations by Edward Snowden in 2013 uncovered a global network of data collection conducted by the United States National Security Agency and its partners. Snowden's own words, "I don't want to live in a world where my government can read my emails, track my phone calls, and record my every move," resonate with Winston's fear of being constantly watched. The ethical dilemma is no longer abstract. It is lived daily by billions of users whose data is harvested for profit and control. Artificial intelligence adds another layer to this surveillance tapestry. AI-driven propaganda, such as deepfake videos and algorithmic echo chambers, can manipulate public opinion with a precision that Orwell could scarcely have imagined. When a political figure's speech is subtly altered to appear more extreme, or when a newsfeed curates content that reinforces existing biases, the result is a form of thought control that mirrors the party's manipulation of language. The philosopher Michel Foucault's concept of biopower, the way in which modern states regulate populations through subtle mechanisms of control, provides a useful lens. Biopower is not only about overt coercion. It is about shaping the conditions of life itself, from health policies to the data that determines credit scores. In this sense, Orwell's concern with the control of language finds a contemporary counterpart in the control of data. Yet Orwell's vision has faced criticism. Some scholars argue that his portrayal of totalitarian regimes is overly pessimistic, that he paints a picture of humanity as inevitably doomed to subjugation. Others contend that his endorsement of liberal democracy is naive, especially given the imperfections and inequities that persist within democratic societies. To address these critiques, we must revisit Orwell's own nuanced articulation of democratic socialism. In his essay Why I Write, he declares, "I am an anti-totalitarian. I am a socialist who believes that the state should be an instrument of the people, not a master." He does not celebrate liberal democracy as a flawless system. Rather, he warns that complacency, accepting the status quo without vigilance, allows authoritarian tendencies to fester even within democratic institutions. The British MI5 surveillance of the 1940s, for example, demonstrates how a democracy can adopt intrusive measures under the guise of security, thereby betraying its own principles. Orwell's counter-argument to the charge of pessimism is found in the very act of resistance he depicts. In 1984, the brief, flickering hope that Winston feels when he meets Julia is a testament to the human capacity for love and rebellion, however fleeting. Their illicit affair, though ultimately crushed, illustrates that even under the most oppressive conditions, the impulse to assert one's humanity persists. Moreover, the ending of Animal Farm, where the other animals stare at the pigs and can no longer distinguish between them, is not a final statement of defeat but a call to vigilance. The battle is not over until the truth is reclaimed. Orwell's optimism, then, is not a naive belief in inevitable triumph, but a steadfast conviction that consciousness and solidarity can, at the very least, keep the flame of dissent alive. To further illuminate Orwell's ethical framework, consider the analogy of a river. A river, left untouched, flows freely, nourishing the land it traverses. When a dam is erected, the water is redirected, its course altered, its power harnessed for human purposes. Yet if the dam is built without regard for the ecosystems downstream, it can cause flood, drought, or loss of biodiversity. In totalitarian regimes, the state acts as a dam, redirecting the flow of human thought and behavior toward the interests of the ruling elite. The individual conscience is the water that seeks its natural path. Solidarity is the network of tributaries that feed the river. Truth is the clear water that reflects the sky. When the dam becomes too high, the pressure builds, and eventually the water may burst through, eroding the dam's foundations. This image captures the dynamic tension between control and resistance that Orwell so vividly portrays. Historical anecdotes also enrich our understanding of how Orwell's ideas manifest in concrete events. During the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, a spontaneous uprising against Soviet domination erupted across the country. The revolutionaries, many of them ordinary citizens, demanded political freedom, national sovereignty, and the right to speak truth to power. Their demands echoed Orwell's insistence on the primacy of truth and solidarity. The Soviet response, massive military intervention, arrests, and executions, served as a stark reminder that totalitarian forces will not hesitate to crush dissent. Yet the very fact that the Hungarian people rose up, despite overwhelming odds, demonstrates the resilience of the human conscience that Orwell believed could never be fully extinguished. Another illustrative episode is the story of the Cambridge Five, a ring of British spies who passed secrets to the Soviet Union during the early Cold War. Their betrayal of the United Kingdom's intelligence services was motivated by a belief in an idealized version of socialism, yet their actions undermined the democratic institutions they claimed to protect. The exposure of the Cambridge Five revealed how ideological commitment, when divorced from critical self-examination, can become a conduit for totalitarian agendas. This episode underscores Orwell's warning that the pursuit of a noble cause must be coupled with rigorous scrutiny of one's own motives and the mechanisms through which power is exercised. In contemporary society, whistleblowing cases serve as modern exemplars of Orwellian resistance. Chelsea Manning's disclosure of classified military documents in 2010, for instance, exposed the human cost of war and challenged the narrative constructed by the state. Manning's statement, "I could not stand by and watch a war that was not being fought on the battlefield," reflects an individual conscience refusing to be complicit in a system that obscures truth. Similarly, the recent revelations about Cambridge Analytica's manipulation of social media data to influence political outcomes highlight how data can be weaponized to shape public opinion, a digital echo of the party's Ministry of Truth. These cases illustrate that the ethical triad of conscience, solidarity, and truth remains relevant even as the tools of oppression evolve. When we juxtapose Orwell's analysis with Hannah Arendt's seminal work The Origins of Totalitarianism, we encounter a convergence of insights. Arendt identifies the atomization of society, where individuals become isolated, lacking communal bonds, as a prerequisite for totalitarian domination. She writes, "The most striking characteristic of totalitarian movements is that they are based on a total denial of the world of human beings." Orwell's emphasis on solidarity directly counters this atomization. His vision of collective resistance is a bulwark against the disintegration of the public sphere that Arendt warns about. Moreover, both thinkers stress the role of ideology as a totalizing narrative that seeks to explain all aspects of life, thereby rendering alternative viewpoints illegitimate. Foucault's notion of biopower, meanwhile, expands Orwell's focus on surveillance into a broader critique of how modern states manage populations through regulatory mechanisms. Biopower operates not only through overt coercion, but through the subtle shaping of norms, health policies, and even the language we use to describe ourselves. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault describes the panopticon as a metaphor for modern disciplinary societies. The possibility of being watched ensures compliance without the need for physical force. Orwell's telescreens are a literal embodiment of this principle, but in the digital age, the panopticon is rendered invisible. Our data is collected, analyzed, and used to predict behavior, often without our explicit consent. The convergence of Orwell's literary imagination with Foucault's philosophical analysis provides a richer understanding of how totalitarian impulses can infiltrate even the most seemingly benign democratic institutions. The ethical stakes of resisting such power structures are heightened by the proliferation of AI-generated content. Imagine a future where deepfake videos can convincingly portray a political leader saying something they never said. The erosion of a shared factual basis would make it increasingly difficult for citizens to discern truth from fabrication. In such a scenario, Orwell's insistence on the preservation of truth becomes not merely a moral imperative, but a practical necessity for the functioning of any political community. The philosopher's famous admonition, "In a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act," takes on renewed urgency when the very tools of deception are algorithmically generated. Yet critics who label Orwell's vision as overly pessimistic point to the resilience of democratic institutions in the post-World War II era. They argue that the spread of liberal values, the rule of law, and free press have created safeguards that prevent the emergence of the kind of totalitarian regime Orwell described. While these safeguards are undeniably valuable, Orwell would caution against complacency. In his essay, The Prevention of Literature, he writes, "If liberty is to be preserved, we must keep the mind awake." The danger, he suggests, is not that totalitarianism is inevitable, but that it can arise when societies allow the gradual erosion of critical thought, when the public becomes accustomed to the surrender of privacy in exchange for convenience, and when the truth is diluted by propaganda. To illustrate this point, consider the case of the United Kingdom's Investigatory Powers Act of 2016, colloquially known as the Snoopers' Charter. The legislation granted expansive powers to intercept communications, store metadata, and compel technology companies to assist in surveillance. Proponents argued that these measures were essential for national security, yet civil liberties groups warned that the law created a legal framework for pervasive monitoring, reminiscent of the surveillance apparatus in 1984. The public debate surrounding the act revealed a tension between the desire for safety and the fear of losing personal autonomy, a tension that Orwell would argue must be navigated with vigilance, not resignation. Another modern illustration is the use of facial recognition technology by law enforcement agencies in various democracies. In cities like London and New York, cameras equipped with AI algorithms can identify individuals in crowds, flagging them for further scrutiny based on databases that may contain erroneous or biased information. The technology's proponents claim it enhances public safety, but critics highlight the potential for abuse, especially against marginalized communities. The ethical dilemma echoes Orwell's cautionary tale. When the state possesses the means to watch us constantly, the line between protection and oppression becomes perilously thin. The question, then, is not whether surveillance can be justified, but how it can be limited to protect the core values of individual conscience and truth. Orwell's own experience with propaganda during the Spanish Civil War offers a personal testament to the power of language in shaping reality. He fought alongside anti-fascist forces, only to become disillusioned by the way the Communist Party manipulated information to suppress dissent within its own ranks. In his memoir Homage to Catalonia, he recounts how the party censored reports of internal conflicts and fabricated victories to maintain morale. He writes, "The truth was not a weapon. It was a shield, and the party had taken it away." This personal betrayal reinforced his belief that any political movement that silences truth is on a path toward totalitarianism, regardless of its professed ideals. In the realm of literature, Orwell's influence extends beyond his own novels. Contemporary authors such as Margaret Atwood in The Handmaid's Tale and Kazuo Ishiguro in Never Let Me Go explore similar themes of surveillance, state control, and the erosion of individual agency. Their works echo Orwell's insistence that the personal is political, that the private sphere is a site of resistance. Atwood herself has acknowledged Orwell's impact, noting that the danger of a society that accepts the erosion of truth is that we become complicit in our own oppression. Such intertextual dialogues demonstrate that Orwell's philosophical concerns continue to inspire critical reflection across artistic mediums. To bring the discussion full circle, let us consider a concrete analogy that captures the interplay between individual conscience, solidarity, and truth. Picture a lighthouse perched on a rugged coastline. The lighthouse's beam represents truth, steady, unblinking, cutting through the darkness of misinformation. The keeper of the lighthouse embodies individual conscience, tending the flame despite storms that threaten to extinguish it. The community of sailors, guided by that beam, represents solidarity. They trust the light to navigate safely, and in turn, they maintain the lighthouse by providing resources and protection. If the light is dimmed, if truth is compromised, ships may crash upon hidden reefs, symbolizing societies that fall into the traps of totalitarian deception. The maintenance of the lighthouse requires vigilance, cooperation, and an unwavering commitment to keep the flame alight. This image, simple yet profound, encapsulates the ethical architecture that Orwell advocates. In confronting the modern manifestations of surveillance, we must ask ourselves, how do we keep our own lighthouses burning? The answer lies in fostering a culture of critical inquiry, where citizens are encouraged to question official narratives, to verify sources, and to engage in open discourse. Digital literacy becomes a form of resistance, as does supporting independent journalism that refuses to bow to corporate or governmental pressure. Whistleblowers like Snowden play a crucial role by exposing hidden mechanisms of control, reminding us that the act of revealing truth can be a catalyst for collective action. Their courage demonstrates that individual conscience, when amplified by solidarity, can challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. Yet, we must also acknowledge the counterargument that such resistance can be counterproductive, leading to paranoia, fragmentation, or the erosion of trust necessary for democratic cooperation. Some scholars argue that an overemphasis on surveillance critique can distract from pressing social issues such as economic inequality, climate change, or healthcare. Orwell, however, would likely respond that these concerns are not mutually exclusive. In 1984, the party's manipulation of language through Newspeak serves to limit the very capacity to articulate grievances about economic or environmental injustice. By curtailing the linguistic tools needed to discuss such issues, totalitarian regimes ensure that broader societal problems remain unaddressed. Thus, safeguarding truth and fostering open discourse are prerequisites for tackling any other moral challenge. The interplay between Orwell's democratic socialism and his wariness of liberal democracy's shortcomings can be further illuminated by examining his essay, The Lion and the Unicorn. There, he writes, "If we are to win the war, we must make a new kind of society, a society which is not a mere continuation of the old." He envisions a post-war Britain where wealth is distributed more equitably. Yet he insists that this must be achieved without sacrificing the freedoms that define a humane society. This nuanced stance rejects both the authoritarian model of Soviet communism and the laissez-faire capitalism that neglects the common good. It is a call for a political middle ground that safeguards both material justice and individual liberty, a balance that remains elusive but essential. Cross-referencing this vision with Arendt's analysis of totalitarianism reveals a complementary insight. Arendt argues that totalitarian movements thrive when they can make the masses feel that they have no choice but to submit. Orwell's insistence on solidarity counters this by providing a collective sense of agency. When people recognize that they are not isolated, that their shared experiences can be articulated and acted upon, the allure of a monolithic authority weakens. In practice, this means building robust civil societies, unions, community groups, independent media that can articulate dissent and propose alternatives. Such institutions function as the counter-forces that Arendt identifies as necessary to prevent the rise of totalitarianism. In the digital age, the formation of online communities can serve as a modern incarnation of this solidarity. Platforms that prioritize user privacy and open dialogue, such as decentralized social networks, offer spaces where individuals can share information without the specter of corporate or state surveillance. The success of these platforms depends on a shared commitment to truth and mutual aid, echoing Orwell's belief that resistance is most effective when it is both personal and collective. However, the same technologies can also be weaponized to spread misinformation, illustrating the dual-edged nature of the tools that shape our public sphere. To further ground our analysis, let us revisit a passage from Animal Farm that captures the paradox of revolutionary rhetoric turned oppressive. The pig squealer declares, "All that is needed is to keep the animals in a constant state of fear, and they will be obedient." This line is not merely a fictional device. It reflects a real tactic employed by totalitarian regimes to maintain control. During Stalin's purges, the atmosphere of fear, fueled by secret police, show trials, and the ever-present threat of denunciation, ensured that dissent was stifled before it could coalesce. The modern equivalent can be observed in the way some governments use anti-terrorism laws to criminalize whistleblowing, thereby creating a climate where citizens self-censor out of fear of reprisal. The continuity of this strategy underscores Orwell's timeless insight. Fear is a more effective tool of domination than overt force. Conversely, the story of the White Rose movement in Nazi Germany offers a poignant illustration of conscience and solidarity confronting a totalitarian regime. A group of university students, led by siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, distributed leaflets that denounced the regime's atrocities and called for moral responsibility. Their pamphlets, though quickly suppressed, embodied the very act of speaking truth to power that Orwell valorizes. When captured, Sophie Scholl famously declared, "Such a fine, sunny day, and I am dying for my country." Her words reveal a profound commitment to moral truth, even in the face of lethal oppression. This historical anecdote affirms that individual conscience, when coupled with collective resolve, can challenge even the most entrenched systems of terror. In the realm of policy, we can observe how democratic societies attempt to balance security and liberty through oversight mechanisms. The United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, established to review requests for surveillance warrants, exemplifies an institutional attempt to restrain state power. Yet critics argue that the court's secretive nature and high approval rates render it ineffective, a modern ministry of truth that validates the state's narrative without rigorous scrutiny. This tension reflects Orwell's warning that the mere existence of legal safeguards does not guarantee their efficacy. They must be actively defended by an informed citizenry. Turning now to the philosophical underpinnings of Orwell's critique, we encounter the concept of doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. This cognitive dissonance is not a purely fictional invention. It finds resonance in contemporary political discourse where facts are dismissed as alternative facts, and the line between reality and fabrication becomes blurred. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek has described this phenomenon as the ideological vacuum that allows the state to fill the gap with its own narratives. When citizens accept that truth is malleable, the ethical foundation for resistance erodes. Orwell's insistence on the sanctity of truth, therefore, serves as a bulwark against the erosion of rational discourse. In addressing the counterargument that Orwell's focus on truth is idealistic in a world where post-truth politics dominate, we can draw upon his own acknowledgement of the difficulty of preserving truth. In 1984, Winston reflects, "The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became the truth." Yet, Winston's rebellion is sparked not by a belief that he can restore an objective past, but by a yearning for an authentic experience of reality. This yearning is what drives whistleblowers, journalists, and ordinary citizens to challenge official narratives, even when the odds of success seem slim. Their perseverance illustrates that truth, while contested, remains a vital horizon toward which societies can strive. To deepen our understanding, let us consider the role of language in shaping power, a theme that runs through both Orwell and Foucault. In The Politics of Language, Orwell argues that political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable. Foucault's analysis of discourse shows that power operates through the production of knowledge, determining what is considered true or false. When language is weaponized to normalize surveillance, terms like national security or data protection become euphemisms that obscure coercive practices. The capacity for resistance is diminished. Recognizing this linguistic manipulation is the first step toward reclaiming agency, a point Orwell makes repeatedly through the character of the pig Napoleon, who rewrites the 7 Commandments to suit his agenda. The interplay of these ideas suggests a practical roadmap for contemporary resistance. First, cultivate critical media literacy to dissect the narratives presented by governments and corporations. Second, support legal frameworks that enforce transparency and accountability, such as robust data protection laws modeled after the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Third, foster community networks that can mobilize quickly in response to threats to civil liberties, much like the underground networks that aided resistance movements during World War II. Finally, encourage the ethical use of technology, open-source encryption tools, for instance, that empower individuals to protect their privacy while communicating securely. Each of these steps embodies Orwell's triad of conscience, solidarity, and truth. In reflecting on Orwell's legacy, we must also acknowledge the limitations of his perspective. As a writer rooted in the mid-20th century, his analysis was shaped by the geopolitical realities of the Cold War, and his focus on state-centric oppression may underplay the ways in which corporate power can also erode democratic freedoms. Contemporary scholars, such as Shoshana Zuboff in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, argue that the commodification of personal data by private entities constitutes a new form of domination that parallels and sometimes exceeds state surveillance. This insight expands Orwell's framework, suggesting that the ethical imperative to protect truth and privacy must extend beyond the public sector to the corporate sphere. Nonetheless, the core of Orwell's philosophy remains remarkably resilient. His insistence that the most effective way to destroy a people is to deny them the right to define their own history resonates in today's battles over historical memory, from debates over statues to the removal of misinformation from public platforms. When societies allow a single narrative to dominate, they risk repeating the mistakes of the past. The act of remembering, of preserving a truthful account of events, is itself an act of resistance, echoing Winston's desire to keep a diary as a testament against erasure. The final piece of the puzzle lies in the moral responsibility of each individual to act. Orwell famously wrote, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." This statement summons us to confront uncomfortable truths, to speak out even when our words may be unwelcome, and to recognize that silence is often the easiest accomplice to tyranny. In the age of algorithmic echo chambers, this call demands that we deliberately seek out dissenting voices, that we question the assumptions embedded in our news feeds, and that we engage in dialogue with those who think differently. It is through this disciplined practice of listening and speaking that the ethical architecture of resistance is kept alive. In sum, George Orwell's exploration of totalitarianism, through the allegory of Animal Farm and the dystopia of 1984, offers a profound philosophical blueprint for confronting the encroachments of power in any era. By foregrounding the triad of individual conscience, solidarity, and truth, he provides a moral compass that guides resistance against both overt state oppression and the more subtle, technologically mediated forms of control that pervade our lives today. The historical anecdotes of Soviet purges and British MI5 surveillance illustrate the concrete mechanisms by which fear and secrecy are wielded, while modern parallels in digital surveillance, AI-driven propaganda, and whistleblowing cases demonstrate the persistence of these dynamics. Counterarguments that dismiss Orwell as pessimistic or naive are met with a nuanced appreciation of his democratic socialism, a vision that seeks justice without sacrificing liberty and that warns against complacency even within democratic societies. Cross-references to Hannah Arendt's analysis of atomization and Foucault's concept of biopower deepen our understanding of the structural forces at play. Ultimately, the task before us is to keep the lighthouse of truth burning, to tend the flame of conscience, and to navigate together through the turbulent seas of misinformation and surveillance. In doing so, we honor Orwell's legacy not merely as a writer of cautionary tales, but as a guide for ethical action in a world where the battle for truth is ongoing, and the stakes are nothing less than the very essence of what it means to be human. The first thing we must ask ourselves before we even begin to name the problem is why the question of poverty matters at all to a moral philosopher. George Orwell, whose name is now almost synonymous with the warning "Big Brother is watching you," was, in his own words, a man of the left who could not ignore the stark reality of hunger, squalor, and the daily grind of the working man. In the opening pages of The Road to Wigan Pier he writes, "I have never been a socialist in the sense that most people understand the word. I am a socialist because I am a human being." That single sentence sets the tone for an ethical project that is not abstract, not merely a theoretical construction, but a lived, visceral concern for the dignity of those whose lives are measured in the length of their shifts and the thinness of their wages. It is a concern that forces us to confront the ways in which a society organizes itself, and how that organization either affirms or denies the moral worth of its members. To understand Orwell's moral stance, we need to locate his work in the intellectual landscape of the early 20th century. He was writing at a time when the Industrial Revolution had already reshaped Britain, but the promises of progress had not yet translated into equitable conditions for the majority. The Great Depression had deepened unemployment, and the rise of fascist movements in Europe made the left's response all the more urgent. In this context, Orwell's Road can be read alongside the work of Karl Marx, whose theory of alienation described how workers become estranged not only from the product of their labor, but from their own humanity. Marx wrote, "The worker becomes all the more he is a commodity." Orwell takes that insight and grounds it in the concrete details of a coal miner's life, the damp, the darkness, the relentless monotony, and the way these conditions erode any sense of self beyond the necessity of survival. Yet Orwell does not simply repeat Marx. He interrogates the left's own failure to recognize the moral urgency of the situation, thereby adding a layer of ethical critique that is both political and profoundly personal. The first vivid example Orwell offers is his description of the living conditions in the industrial towns of Yorkshire and Lancashire. He walks through the narrow streets of Wigan and sees the soot-blackened houses, the cracked windows, the smell of coal dust that clings to everything like a second skin. He notes that the families live in a perpetual winter, not because of the weather, but because the coal that should warm them is a luxury they cannot afford. He writes, "The men are tired, the women are tired, the children are tired." This simple repetition is not a literary flourish, it is a moral indictment. By repeating the word tired, Orwell forces the listener to feel the weight of exhaustion that is not a virtue, but a symptom of a system that extracts labor without replenishing the human spirit. The image of a child with a thin, pallid face, the eyes sunken, the hair unwashed, the clothes threadbare becomes a moral mirror. If we, as readers, feel a pang of shame at this description, Orwell is already succeeding in his ethical project. He wants us to see the working man not as an abstract statistic, but as a person whose dignity is being compromised. The second example is Orwell's criticism of the British left's indifference to the very people it claims to champion. He writes, "The left, in its intellectual arrogance, has become a class of its own, more interested in the purity of doctrine than in the real misery of the working man." He points out that many left-wing intellectuals, though vocally opposed to fascism and capitalism, would still attend a fashionable dinner party and discuss art while the miner's wife struggles to keep a fire lit. In a particularly biting passage he observes, "If you are a man of the left, you must be ashamed of the fact that you have never set foot in a slum, never slept on a pallet, never felt the cold bite of a winter night without a blanket." This is not a mere accusation of hypocrisy. It is a call to moral responsibility. Orwell is asking the left to confront its own alienation, to recognize that the abstract ideals of socialism can become empty if they are not rooted in the lived experience of the people they aim to liberate. Orwell's concept of the honest working man is central to his moral philosophy. He describes this figure as someone who, despite the crushing weight of poverty, retains a sense of integrity and a willingness to work honestly. He writes, "The honest working man is not a revolutionary in the sense of a man who wants to overturn the world. He simply wants to be treated as a human being." This notion resonates with the Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics, where the good life is defined by the cultivation of character traits such as honesty, courage, and temperance. In Orwell's view, the honest working man embodies these virtues not because he has been instructed by philosophical treatises, but because his very existence requires a steadfastness that transcends mere survival. The moral implication is profound. Virtue is not the exclusive domain of the educated elite. It is present in the daily labor of those who, against all odds, maintain a sense of moral agency. When we bring Rawls's theory of justice as fairness into the conversation, the parallels become striking. Rawls argues that a just society is one in which the principles of justice are those that would be chosen behind a veil of ignorance. If we imagine ourselves behind that veil, unaware of our own social position, we would likely choose a system that safeguards basic liberties and ensures that social and economic inequalities are arranged to benefit the least advantaged. Orwell's detailed accounts of the working class's suffering can be read as a vivid illustration of what Rawls would call the difference principle in action, or rather, its failure. By exposing the stark inequities, Orwell is implicitly urging us to adopt a Rawlsian perspective, to design institutions that do not merely tolerate poverty, but actively work to ameliorate it. The honest working man, then, becomes the embodiment of the least advantaged, whose well-being is the litmus test for the moral health of the whole society. Yet Orwell's approach has not escaped criticism. One of the most persistent counterarguments is that he romanticizes the working class, painting the honest laborer with a brush of noble suffering that obscures the complexities of class struggle. Critics point to passages where Orwell seems to elevate the miner's stoicism to a kind of moral heroism, suggesting that he overlooks the agency of the working class to organize and resist. To address this, we must return to the text. In The Road, Orwell does not merely celebrate the miner's endurance. He also documents the hopelessness that pervades the community, noting that many men have given up any thought of improvement. He records the lack of imagination that the conditions have imposed upon them, and he is clear that the honest working man is not a static ideal, but a figure caught in a web of structural oppression. By acknowledging both the dignity and the despair, Orwell avoids the trap of romanticism. He recognizes that the moral worth of the working man does not absolve society of its responsibility to change the conditions that make such dignity a costly sacrifice. A second line of critique claims that Orwell's analysis is itself class-biased, that his middle-class background colors his perception of poverty, leading him to interpret the working class through a lens of paternalism. Some scholars argue that his descriptions, while vivid, are filtered through a spectator's gaze that cannot fully capture the lived experience of those he observes. This accusation is not without merit. Orwell was indeed an outsider in many of the communities he entered. However, his methodological honesty mitigates this concern. He frequently prefaces his observations with self-critical remarks such as, "I am aware that I am an intruder, that my presence may alter the very reality I seek to describe." Moreover, his willingness to live among the miners for weeks, to sleep in the same damp rooms, and to work in the mines himself demonstrates a commitment to immersive journalism that goes beyond mere voyeurism. By placing himself in the very conditions he critiques, Orwell attempts to bridge the gap between observer and participant, thereby strengthening the credibility of his moral assessment. The historical anecdote of the 1934 Hunger March, in which thousands of unemployed workers marched from the north of England to London, provides a concrete illustration of the tensions Orwell identifies. The marchers carried banners that read "bread and work," and they were met with police brutality and media ridicule. Orwell, writing later, reflects on this event, noting that the left's failure to support the marchers was a betrayal of its own principles. The march underscores how the political left, in his view, could become detached from the very people whose plight should animate its activism. It also shows how the honest working man, when pushed to the brink, can become a potent symbol of collective resistance, a symbol that, if harnessed responsibly, can transform personal virtue into public justice. Another historical vignette comes from Orwell's time as a volunteer in the Spanish Civil War, an experience he recounts in Homage to Catalonia. There, he witnesses the internal purges among the left, where ideological purity becomes a weapon against comrades. He writes, "It is not the fascist enemy that terrified me, but the way in which the left turned on itself, sacrificing the very principles of solidarity it claimed to uphold." This episode reinforces his critique of authoritarian socialism. A system that prioritizes doctrine over humanity inevitably reproduces the alienation Marx warned against. By juxtaposing the Spanish experience with the English working class, Orwell draws a line from the mines of Wigan to the battlefields of Spain, showing that the moral failings he identifies are not confined to a single nation, but are endemic to any ideology that neglects the human condition. To bring these ideas into the present day, consider the modern phenomenon of gig economy labor. Workers today often face precarious contracts, lack of benefits, and the constant threat of algorithmic monitoring. The same questions Orwell raised about the dignity of honest work, about the responsibility of the left to stand with the exploited, resonate loudly. If we imagine a gig worker as a contemporary honest working man, we can ask, does society provide the structures that Rawls would deem necessary to protect the least advantaged? Are we, as a political community, willing to recognize the virtue of those who, despite insecurity, continue to deliver essential services? The answer in many places remains a sobering no, suggesting that Orwell's call for humane, democratic socialism is as urgent now as it was in the 1930s. Modern interpretations of Orwell's moral philosophy often emphasize his democratic socialism as a third way between unfettered capitalism and totalitarian communism. Scholars such as Christopher Hitchens have argued that Orwell's insistence on personal integrity and democratic accountability makes his socialism fundamentally different from the state centrism of the Soviet model. Hitchens writes, Orwell wanted a socialism that was rooted in the everyday lives of ordinary people, not in the abstract plans of bureaucrats. This reading aligns with the virtue-ethical dimension of Orwell's work. A society must cultivate honest individuals, not merely enforce equitable outcomes. In this sense, Orwell anticipates contemporary discussions about social entrepreneurship and participatory economics, where the focus shifts from redistribution alone to the empowerment of individuals to act virtuously within a supportive framework. Analogies can help clarify Orwell's stance. Imagine a garden that has been neglected for years. Weeds overrun the soil, the plants are stunted, and the soil itself has become compacted. A capitalist approach might argue that the garden will thrive if left to natural selection, allowing the strongest plants to survive while the weak perish. A totalitarian socialist approach might dictate that a single gardener decides which plants to keep, pruning away any that do not fit a predetermined design. Orwell's democratic socialism, however, proposes that the garden be tended collectively, that each gardener, no matter how small, has a say in how the soil is enriched, that the tools are shared, and that the fruits of the harvest are distributed fairly. The honest working man is the gardener who, despite his limited resources, tends his plot with care, ensuring that the garden as a whole can flourish. This analogy captures the essence of Orwell's moral vision. A society that respects individual virtue while providing the communal structures necessary for all to thrive. Returning to Marx, we see a clear point of convergence and divergence. Marx's theory of alienation describes how labor under capitalism estranges the worker from the product, from the process, from fellow workers, and ultimately from his own humanity. Orwell's observations of the miner's life illustrate these four dimensions. The miner does not own the coal he extracts. The repetitive, dangerous work leaves little room for creative engagement. The competition for scarce jobs pits neighbor against neighbor, and the endless grind erodes a sense of self beyond the wage check. Yet Orwell goes further by critiquing the left's failure to address these alienations in practice. While Marx provides a structural diagnosis, Orwell supplies a moral prescription. The left must embody the virtues it preaches, must stand with the honest working man, and must reject both capitalist exploitation and authoritarian dogma. In doing so, Orwell bridges the gap between structural analysis and ethical responsibility. Rawls's Veil of Ignorance offers a useful thought experiment for evaluating Orwell's proposals. If we were to design a society without knowing whether we would be a wealthy industrialist, a middle-class bureaucrat, or a coal miner, we would likely choose a system that guarantees basic liberties, fair wages, and access to education and health care. Orwell's narrative of the working class's deprivation serves as a vivid illustration of what happens when a society is built without such a veil, when the privileged design institutions that preserve their advantage at the expense of the most vulnerable. By exposing the lived reality of poverty, Orwell forces us to confront the moral absurdity of a system that would, under Rawls's test, be deemed unjust. In this way, The Road to Wigan Pier can be read as a literary counterpart to Rawls's philosophical argument, each reinforcing the other's call for a more equitable social contract. Real-world applications of Orwell's moral philosophy can be seen in contemporary policy debates. Take, for example, the movement for a universal basic income, UBI. Proponents argue that a guaranteed income would restore dignity to those whose labor is undervalued or displaced by automation. Critics claim that UBI could erode the work ethic, creating a class of dependents. Orwell would likely evaluate this proposal through the lens of the honest working man. Does a basic income empower individuals to live with dignity, or does it become a paternalistic handout that removes agency? He would ask whether the policy is designed with democratic participation, ensuring that those it aims to help have a voice in its formulation. In this sense, Orwell's emphasis on moral responsibility and democratic socialism offers a nuanced framework for assessing modern welfare policies, urging us to balance material support with respect for individual agency. Another modern illustration is the rise of cooperative enterprises, where workers own and manage the business collectively. These models echo Orwell's vision of a socialism that is not imposed from above but built from the ground up. In a cooperative, the honest working man is not merely a laborer but also a stakeholder, sharing in the profits and decision-making. This aligns with Rawls's difference principle, as the cooperative structure seeks to benefit the least advantaged members. Yet, as Orwell cautions, such initiatives must avoid becoming insulated elites. They must remain transparent, accountable, and open to broader societal engagement. The success of cooperative models, therefore, can be seen as a partial realization of Orwell's democratic socialism, provided they retain the humility and solidarity he demanded. To deepen our understanding, let us consider an analogy drawn from literature. In Charles Dickens's Hard Times, the character of Stephen Blackpool is a factory worker who, despite his hardships, maintains a sense of moral integrity. Dickens uses Stephen to critique industrial capitalism, much as Orwell uses the miner to critique both capitalism and a complacent left. Both authors show that virtue can exist amid oppression, but they also illustrate that virtue alone cannot dismantle systemic injustice. The presence of a morally upright individual does not absolve society from the duty to create just institutions. This parallel reinforces Orwell's argument that personal virtue must be complemented by collective action and structural reform. Orwell's narrative also contains an implicit critique of the culture of shame that can accompany poverty. He observes that the working class often internalizes society's contempt, leading to self-blame and resignation. He writes, "The poor have learned to be ashamed of their condition, and in that shame they become complicit in their own oppression." This insight anticipates modern discussions about the psychological impact of stigma as explored by scholars like Irving Goffman. Goffman's concept of spoiled identity describes how individuals who are labeled as deviant internalize that label, which in turn affects their behavior and self-perception. Orwell's early articulation of this phenomenon highlights his forward-looking moral analysis. True justice must not only redistribute material resources, but also restore the self-respect of those who have been marginalized. A further historical anecdote enriches our picture of Orwell's moral journey. In 1936, after returning from the coalfields, Orwell attended a meeting of the Independent Labour Party, ILP, in Manchester. The party leaders, eager to present a polished image, dismissed his calls for direct engagement with the unemployed. One senior member remarked, "We must not be seen as a charity organization. We are a political movement." Orwell's response was sharp. "If we are not a charity, then we must at least be a conscience." This exchange encapsulates his insistence that political movements cannot separate moral conscience from strategic objectives. The ILP's reluctance to confront poverty directly illustrates the very tension Orwell identifies: the left's tendency to prioritize ideological purity over immediate human need. In the decades following The Road, Orwell's moral concerns have continued to reverberate. The post-war welfare state in Britain, with its National Health Service and expanded social security, can be seen as a partial fulfillment of his democratic socialist vision. Yet the subsequent neoliberal turn of the 1980s, with its emphasis on market deregulation and reduced state intervention, revived many of the inequities Orwell warned about. The resurgence of austerity measures in the 21st century, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, has again thrown the plight of the honest working man into stark relief. The repeated cycles of reform and retrenchment suggest that Orwell's call for a humane socialism remains an unfinished project, one that demands continual vigilance and moral courage. When we examine Orwell's arguments in light of virtue ethics, we see a compelling synthesis. Virtue ethics, rooted in the works of Aristotle, holds that the good life is achieved through the cultivation of character traits that enable individuals to flourish within their community. Orwell's honest working man, who endures hardship while maintaining integrity, exemplifies the virtue of fortitude. Moreover, Orwell's insistence that the left must act with humility and empathy reflects the virtue of justice, not merely as a distributive principle, but as a relational one, justice as the recognition of each person's inherent worth. In this way, Orwell bridges the gap between the ancient philosophical tradition of virtue and the modern political struggle for social justice. Counterarguments that accuse Orwell of romanticizing the working class often cite his portrayal of the miner's stoic acceptance as evidence of an idealized narrative. However, a close reading of the text reveals that Orwell does not celebrate stoicism for its own sake. He writes, "There is a fatalism in the air, a sense that the future is a continuation of the present, and that any hope for change is a distant dream. This fatalism is not praised. It is lamented. By documenting both the dignity and the despair, Orwell avoids the trap of sentimentalism. He acknowledges that the honest working man is not a mythic hero, but a real person caught in a web of structural forces that limit his agency. The moral lesson, then, is not that we should admire suffering, but that we must work to dismantle the conditions that make such suffering inevitable." The second major critique, that Orwell's own class background biases his analysis, finds a nuanced response in his methodological transparency. Throughout The Road, Orwell repeatedly reminds the reader of his outsider status. He writes, "I am aware that I am a stranger in these places, that my presence may be intrusive." By foregrounding his positionality, he invites readers to question his observations, rather than presenting them as immutable truths. Moreover, his willingness to endure the same hardships he describes, sleeping on damp straw, working in the mines for a week, demonstrates an ethical commitment to experiential understanding. While no observer can ever fully escape their own perspective, Orwell's approach models a humility that strengthens, rather than weakens, his moral arguments. In synthesizing these strands, Orwell's vivid description of poverty, his critique of leftist complacency, his concept of the honest working man, the cross-references to Marx's alienation and Rawls's justice, the historical anecdotes, the modern applications, and the counter-arguments, we arrive at a comprehensive picture of his moral philosophy. It is a philosophy that insists on the inseparability of personal virtue and social structures, that demands democratic participation from the left, and that rejects both the ruthless exploitation of capitalism and the authoritarian impulse of some socialist experiments. It is a call for a socialism that is lived, not merely theorized, a socialism that honors the dignity of the worker as a moral agent, not merely as a unit of production. To bring this full circle, let us imagine a contemporary policy debate about housing. In many cities, low-income families are forced into overcrowded, unsafe accommodations, echoing the cramped, damp houses of Wigan. A Rawlsian analysis would deem such housing arrangements a violation of the difference principle. An Orwellian response would add a moral dimension. Beyond the statistical injustice, there is a betrayal of the honest working man's right to a safe home, a right that is essential for the cultivation of virtue. Policymakers, therefore, must not only allocate resources, but also engage with the lived experiences of those affected, ensuring that the solutions are co-created, democratic, and respectful of human dignity. This integrated approach captures the spirit of Orwell's moral philosophy, a blend of structural critique, ethical responsibility, and democratic participation. In conclusion, George Orwell's exploration of class, poverty, and the proletarian narrative offers a timeless moral challenge. By grounding his analysis in concrete observations, by cross-referencing the theories of Marx and Rawls, and by insisting on a humane, democratic socialism, he provides a roadmap for ethical political action. The honest working man, as Orwell portrays him, is both a moral exemplar and a reminder of the work still required to build a just society. The counterarguments that accuse him of romanticism or bias, when examined closely, reveal not flaws but the depth of his self-critical method. As we confront new forms of economic precarity and political polarization, Orwell's voice, steady, reflective, and unflinching, continues to echo, urging us to ask once more what kind of world we wish to create and what responsibilities we bear toward those who labor in its shadows. When we think of George Orwell, the image that often rises unbidden is that of a man perched at a desk, his pen scratching out a warning against the tyranny of language, the erosion of truth, and the relentless march of power. Yet that image is only the surface of a deeper philosophical terrain, a terrain that stretches far beyond the pages of 1984 and Animal Farm and reaches into the very fabric of our digital age. In this segment, we will trace the contours of Orwell's philosophical contributions, map them onto the debates that dominate the 21st century, and ask, with a calm and reflective curiosity, whether the insights of a mid-20th century writer can still illuminate the shadows cast by algorithms, alternative facts, and the ever-expanding reach of data surveillance. Orwell's philosophical project was never a tidy system of doctrines. It was a persistent interrogation of how language shapes power and how power, in turn, seeks to bend language to its own ends. In his essay, Politics and the English Language, he argued that political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. This observation was not a mere stylistic critique. It was a claim about the very conditions under which a free society can flourish. If the words we use are deliberately mudded, if clarity is sacrificed on the altar of euphemism, then the capacity for citizens to recognize injustice is compromised. The phrase doublethink, coined in 1984, captures this paradox: the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously, to accept the official narrative even when it runs counter to observable reality. For Orwell, the manipulation of language was the engine of totalitarian control, and the antidote was a vigilant, critical engagement with words. Fast forward to the present, and the mechanisms of language manipulation have taken on new forms. The rise of social media platforms has turned every user into a potential broadcaster, while sophisticated algorithms curate the streams of information that shape our perceptions. In the 2016 United States presidential election, for example, a private firm known as Cambridge Analytica harvested data from millions of Facebook profiles and used psychographic profiling to deliver hyper-targeted political advertisements. The content of those ads was not simply a matter of factual statements. It was an engineered appeal to emotional triggers, a subtle reframing of political issues that leveraged the very linguistic tricks Orwell warned against. The algorithmic amplification of such content meant that users were repeatedly exposed to messages that reinforced pre-existing biases, creating echo chambers where dissenting facts struggled to find a foothold. Consider the case of the Russian Internet Research Agency, a state-linked entity that during the same election cycle deployed thousands of fake accounts, bots, and troll farms to sow division across the political spectrum. Their strategy hinged on the deliberate blurring of truth and falsehood, the planting of narratives that could not be easily traced to a single source. The phrase alternative facts, popularized in a 2017 press briefing by a senior advisor to the U.S. president, exemplifies this phenomenon. When asked to comment on the size of a political rally, the spokesperson responded, "The president says there were 1.3 million people there, and that is the number we have." The statement was not a factual correction, but an assertion of a reality that contradicted observable evidence. In Orwellian terms, it was a clear instance of "the party told you to forget it." The party told you that the past does not exist. The power to declare an alternative version of reality and to demand that it be accepted is precisely what Orwell feared. These modern case studies illustrate how the core of Orwell's philosophy, concern for the integrity of language and the dangers of its distortion, remains strikingly relevant. Yet some scholars argue that Orwell's framework is insufficient for the complexities of a networked information environment. Evgeny Morozov, for instance, contends that Orwell's focus on state surveillance overlooks the subtler, more diffuse forms of power exercised by corporations that own the platforms where public discourse occurs. He writes that the Orwellian model of a monolithic, centrally controlled apparatus is eclipsed by a constellation of data brokers, algorithmic curators, and private interests whose influence is less visible but no less potent. From this perspective, the metaphor of the Big Brother watching from a central tower seems outdated when power is distributed across a web of interconnected actors. The critique is not without merit. Orwell wrote in a time when the primary conduit of mass communication was the state-run newspaper, the radio broadcast, or the televised speech. Today, a user's newsfeed is assembled by an opaque algorithm that balances engagement metrics, advertising revenue, and user preferences in ways that are not publicly disclosed. The surveillance is not merely observational. It is predictive, shaping not only what we see, but also what we might think we want to see. In this sense, the architecture of power has mutated, and the language of Orwellian oppression requires an update. Nevertheless, the timelessness of Orwell's insights lies in his deeper philosophical claim that power inevitably seeks to control the terms of thought, and that the erosion of linguistic clarity is a primary weapon in that quest. Slavoj Žižek, the contemporary philosopher known for his provocative readings of ideology, picks up this thread when he declares that ideology is not simply a set of ideas, but the very way we experience reality. Žižek's reading of 1984 emphasizes that the party's control is less about overt coercion than about the shaping of the real that individuals inhabit. The algorithmic filters that decide which articles appear on a newsfeed perform a similar function. They construct a mediated reality in which certain truths are foregrounded while others are relegated to the periphery. In Žižek's terms, the algorithm becomes a symbolic order that dictates the parameters of our desire and belief. Judith Butler offers another complementary perspective. In her work on performative truth, she argues that truth is not a static correspondence to an objective reality, but is enacted through repeated performative acts that confer legitimacy. When a political figure repeatedly asserts a falsehood, the utterance itself can, through the mechanisms of power, become accepted as truth. This aligns with Orwell's warning that the purpose of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought. Butler would suggest that the repetitive performance of alternative facts on television, in press releases, and across social media platforms functions as a performative act that reshapes the public's sense of what counts as fact. The convergence of Orwell's concern with language, Žižek's focus on the symbolic order, and Butler's theory of performativity creates a triangulated understanding of how contemporary power structures manipulate truth. To see this triangulation in action, let us revisit the Cambridge Analytica episode, but this time through the lens of performative truth. The firm's micro-targeted ads did not merely present information. They presented a curated version of reality tailored to the psychological profile of each viewer. By repeatedly exposing a user to messages that framed a political candidate as either a threat or a savior, the campaign performed a version of truth that became increasingly hard to disentangle from the user's own lived experience. The algorithmic reinforcement of these messages through likes, shares, and comments served as a feedback loop, solidifying the performative claim. In Butler's terms, the repeated utterance of a particular political narrative becomes a truth-performing act, especially when the platform itself amplifies it without critical mediation. The ethical dimension of these developments brings us to the question of data privacy, another arena where Orwell's warnings echo. In 1984, the party's surveillance is embodied in the omnipresent telescreens that record every spoken word, every movement. The modern analog is the data trail left by every click, every location ping, every biometric scan. The philosopher Shoshana Zuboff, in her analysis of surveillance capitalism, argues that the extraction of personal data has become a new form of economic exploitation, one that turns individuals into raw material for predictive modeling. While Orwell imagined a state that watches, Zuboff describes a market that watches, yet the underlying logic is similar: the accumulation of information to exert influence over behavior. The philosophical continuity is clear. When knowledge about individuals is weaponized, the capacity for autonomous decision-making erodes. Critics who claim Orwell's framework is obsolete often point to the sheer scale and speed of data flows as a departure from the slower, more centralized mechanisms of the past. They argue that the Orwellian metaphor, once a powerful indictment of totalitarianism, risks becoming a cliché that obscures the nuanced ways in which power operates today. Yet the danger of such a dismissal is that it may blind us to the fundamental continuity of the problem. The manipulation of language and the control of information remain central to domination, regardless of the medium. The difference lies in the agents and the tools, not in the underlying dynamics. As Žižek would remind us, the form changes, but the function remains. The function is the preservation and expansion of power through the shaping of perceived reality. Let us now consider a concrete illustration of how language manipulation operates in the realm of public health, an area that has become especially salient in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. During the early months of the crisis, governmental briefings often employed the phrase "flatten the curve" as a rallying call. While the phrase is scientifically grounded, its repeated use without adequate contextual explanation led to simplification that obscured the complex trade-offs involved in policy decisions, such as the balance between economic shutdowns and mental health impacts. Critics argued that the slogan functioned as a form of political language that made a complex reality appear straightforward, thereby limiting public debate. In Orwellian terms, the slogan served as a linguistic device that narrowed the space for dissent, echoing his warning that the fight against the misuse of language is a fight against the misuse of power. A second example comes from the realm of environmental policy. The term greenwashing has entered the public lexicon to describe corporate attempts to present themselves as environmentally responsible while continuing practices that harm the planet. Companies often deploy glossy reports, selective statistics, and emotive language to create the illusion of sustainability. The language of net zero has become a buzzword, yet without rigorous accounting standards, it can mask ongoing emissions. Here, the manipulation of language functions not only to mislead consumers, but also to shape regulatory discourse. By framing climate action in terms of market-friendly solutions, powerful interests can steer policy away from more radical systemic changes. This, too, is a contemporary echo of Orwell's insight that political language is designed to make lies sound truthful. Returning to the political sphere, the phrase alternative facts has taken on a life of its own. When a political figure declares an alternative fact, the immediate effect is not merely a factual error. It is the creation of a parallel epistemic space in which the official narrative is contested. The rhetorical strategy is to cast the opposition's insistence on verifiable data as fake news, thereby delegitimizing the source of the truth claim. This mirrors the party's slogan, "Ignorance is strength," where the denial of objective reality is framed as a virtue. The modern twist, however, lies in the speed with which these alternative facts proliferate. Within minutes, a tweet can be retweeted thousands of times, each iteration reinforcing the falsehood. The cumulative effect is a destabilization of the shared factual basis that undergirds democratic deliberation. Scholars such as Cass Sunstein have warned about the information cocoon effect, where individuals become insulated from contradictory viewpoints, leading to polarization. Sunstein's research suggests that exposure to a diversity of perspectives is essential for a healthy democratic process. Orwell's emphasis on the necessity of clear, unadorned language aligns with this view. If language is garbled, the ability to engage with opposing arguments is compromised. The modern challenge, then, is to cultivate a public sphere where linguistic clarity is not only valued, but protected against the incentives that drive platforms to prioritize engagement over accuracy. In light of these observations, it is instructive to revisit an anecdote from Orwell's own life that underscores his commitment to vigilance. During World War II, while working for the BBC's Eastern Service, Orwell was tasked with broadcasting propaganda aimed at bolstering morale among British listeners. Yet he was acutely aware of the thin line between persuasive communication and the distortion of truth. He wrote in a diary entry, "I am a socialist, but I cannot accept the idea that any political movement may be justified by the use of lies." This personal struggle illustrates that even in a context of wartime exigency, Orwell insisted on the moral imperative to safeguard truth. The anecdote resonates today when governments justify the curtailment of civil liberties in the name of security, often employing language that conflates necessity with inevitability. Another historical vignette that illuminates Orwell's relevance involves the 1956 Hungarian uprising. In the wake of the Soviet suppression of the revolt, Western media faced the challenge of reporting events that were shrouded in Soviet propaganda. The phrase "the Iron Curtain," originally coined by Churchill, became a linguistic tool that framed the Soviet bloc as an impenetrable barrier of oppression. Yet the nuanced realities on the ground were often lost in the binary framing. Orwell would have recognized this as an example of Newspeak in action, where the reduction of complex events to stark oppositions serves to simplify public perception and limit critical engagement. The lesson for today is that the simplification of geopolitics into us versus them narratives continues to be a potent method of controlling public opinion. We have now traversed a landscape that stretches from the early warnings of Orwell's essays to the algorithmic battlegrounds of contemporary politics, from the philosophical reflections of Butler and Zizek to the empirical studies of Sunstein and Zuboff. The thread that binds these disparate strands is the recognition that power, in its many guises, seeks to shape the terms of thought by manipulating language, by curating information, and by constructing realities that serve its interests. The question remains, does Orwell's framework provide a sufficient toolkit for navigating this terrain, or must we look beyond his insights to develop new conceptual resources? One argument for the continued relevance of Orwell's thought is that his analysis operates at a meta level that transcends specific technologies. By focusing on the relationship between language and power, he offers a diagnostic lens that can be applied to any medium, be it the printed pamphlet, the televised broadcast, or the algorithmic feed. As Zizek reminds us, the content of ideology is always the same, only the form changes. In this view, the form of the medium is secondary to the underlying logic that seeks to fix a particular version of reality as the only acceptable one. Orwell's insistence on the need for clear and honest language becomes a timeless call to resist the seduction of convenient narratives, regardless of whether they are delivered by a state-run newspaper or a machine learning model. Conversely, critics argue that Orwell's focus on the totalitarian state neglects the pluralistic, networked nature of contemporary power structures. They point out that today's political influence is diffused across a constellation of actors. Tech corporations, data brokers, political consultants, and even individual influencers. In this decentralized ecosystem, the mechanisms of control are less overt, more insidious, and often cloaked in the language of personalization and user empowerment. The critique suggests that a philosophy centered on Big Brother may obscure the ways in which individuals consent, sometimes unwittingly, to the surrender of privacy and agency. In this sense, the metaphor may be too blunt to capture the subtleties of modern power. The counter-argument, however, is that Orwell's emphasis on the politics of language precisely equips us to interrogate the rhetoric of consent and empowerment. When a platform tells us that we personalize your experience for you, the statement appears benign, even benevolent. Yet the underlying logic is that the platform controls the parameters of what we see, shaping preferences in ways we may not recognize. The language of personalization becomes a veil, a form of soft power that masks the asymmetry between the data collector and the data subject. Orwell's warning that the purpose of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought can be read as a caution against any linguistic framing that reduces the complexity of a relationship to a single, comforting narrative. In this light, the critique that Orwell is outdated may itself be an example of the very simplification he warned against. Let us now consider a concrete policy debate that illustrates the interplay of these ideas. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. The regulation was designed to give individuals greater control over their personal data, mandating transparency, consent, and the right to be forgotten. Proponents argue that GDPR restores a measure of agency in the face of pervasive data collection. Critics, however, claim that the language of the regulation, terms like personal data, processing, and legitimate interest, is itself a product of legal and corporate discourse that can be interpreted in ways that dilute its intended protections. The debate over the precise definitions of these terms reflects Orwell's concern that the manipulation of language can determine the scope of rights. When a law is written in ambiguous language, it creates room for loopholes that powerful actors can exploit. The tension between clarity and ambiguity in legal drafting is a modern echo of Orwell's battle against vague, pretentious, and inflated language. Another modern illustration can be found in the realm of artificial intelligence ethics. Companies developing facial recognition technology often employ the term bias mitigation to describe efforts to reduce discriminatory outcomes. While the phrase suggests a commitment to fairness, critics argue that the underlying datasets and training methodologies may still embed structural biases, and that the term bias mitigation can be used to deflect deeper scrutiny. In this context, the language of mitigation becomes a performative act, similar to Butler's notion of truth performed through repetition, that signals ethical responsibility without necessarily delivering substantive change. Orwell would likely have seen this as a form of doublethink, acknowledging a problem while simultaneously denying its full impact. The cross-reference to Judith Butler's theory of performative truth offers a valuable lens for dissecting these corporate statements. If the repeated proclamation of bias mitigation is treated as a truth-performing utterance, it can gradually shift public perception, making the technology appear more benign even if the underlying issues persist. The performative power of language thus becomes a tool for maintaining legitimacy in the face of critique. This dynamic underscores the relevance of Orwell's insistence that the battle for the soul of a society is fought in the realm of language. We have explored how Orwell's insights intersect with contemporary concerns about fake news, algorithmic manipulation, alternative facts, and data privacy. Yet the conversation would be incomplete without addressing the role of education and individual responsibility in this ecosystem. Orwell famously wrote, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." This statement points to a moral imperative. the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. In the digital age, that willingness translates into practices such as fact-checking, diversifying information sources, and cultivating a habit of critical reading. The philosopher John Dewey emphasized that the function of education is to teach one to think, not what to think. When combined with Orwell's advocacy for linguistic clarity, the educational mission becomes a bulwark against the erosion of shared reality. Scholars like Cass Sunstein and Daniel Kahneman have highlighted the cognitive biases that predispose individuals to accept information that confirms existing beliefs. The confirmation bias and the availability heuristic mean that people are naturally drawn to narratives that feel familiar or emotionally resonant. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement exploit these biases by presenting content that aligns with users' pre-existing preferences. The result is a feedback loop that reinforces falsehoods, making the task of maintaining an accurate understanding of the world more arduous. Here, Orwell's call for vigilance is not merely a rhetorical flourish. It is a practical recommendation for developing habits that counteract the algorithmic reinforcement of bias. In light of these considerations, let us entertain a few reflective questions that may guide our own engagement with the digital world. How often do we pause before sharing a headline, allowing ourselves a moment to interrogate the language and the source? When we encounter a claim that seems to align perfectly with our political or ideological preferences, do we notice the subtle ways in which the phrasing may be designed to bypass critical scrutiny? In what ways can we cultivate an Orwellian vigilance in our daily routines? Perhaps by regularly consulting multiple news outlets, by questioning the framing of statistics, or by supporting platforms that prioritize transparency over engagement metrics. And finally, how might we collectively demand that corporations and governments adopt clearer, more accountable language in their policies, thereby reducing the space in which alternative facts can thrive? The answers to these questions are not predetermined. They require an ongoing, reflective practice. As we navigate a world where the boundaries between truth and fabrication blur, where the very architecture of information is shaped by profit motives and political agendas, the philosophical legacy of George Orwell invites us to remain attentive to the power of words. It asks us to recognize that the battle for a free society is fought not only on the streets or in the voting booth, but also in the quiet moments when we choose to read, to question, and to speak. In the words of Orwell himself, in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. May that act become a habit, a shared commitment, and a guiding principle as we confront the challenges of the 21st century.